Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Jordan Hall. Jordan is no stranger for the folks who will be watching this podcast, so a man who needs no introduction. Um, I'll set this up in a little bit after I welcome Jordan, but the main context here is to talk about not just the recent news that Jordan shared with a couple of folks on various podcasts about his recent conversion to Christianity, but sort of getting into what that looks like, what that means for conceptions of metamodern Christian theology and whatnot. It's not really something that has been explored too much in this space. And given my background, I'm really curious to hear how Jordan is making sense of this stuff and to get into some of the ideas around it. And so, again, I'll share more about the context in a minute. But before anything else, Jordan, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, welcome. This is going to be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just saying, before we started recording, that I've been following your stuff for a while and figured that at some point we'd have a conversation, and I'm glad that we now have occasion to because, this topic is something really interesting to me. And when you did that podcast with Daniel Thorson, kind of talking about this, and have subsequently done a few more describing sort of this, personal spiritual journey that you've been through over the years. It's recently led you to actually getting baptized in a Christian church in North Carolina. It raised a whole bunch of fascinating things for me. My background is in Christianity. I grew up in a kind of conservative evangelical Christian tradition, got really into it, studied, the Bible and Greek and Hebrew and all that stuff, went pretty far down into that. But then also had this sort of like existential crisis, kind of a crisis of meaning, as I had to kind of grapple with where a lot of that stuff sort of bumps into historical critical scholarship and sort of philosophical stuff and everything. And so one of the things that was so interesting about hearing your journey is you're a profoundly reflective, thoughtful, intellectual fellow. And so one of the questions that I know a couple people had were sort of like, wow, I'd love to know how this is landing, how this makes sense for you, the kind of way that you're approaching the theological angle and the sort of creedal angle of this very traditional religion, and trying to make sense of that in a kind of modern, meta-modern context, right? Which is really what this podcast is kind of all about exploring. So that's sort of it. And so I want to kind of throw some stuff by you and see how you're making sense of it all. So that's sort of the framework here. And so yeah, thanks for willing to be a part of this. So yeah, that's basically where I'm coming at this. And so I'll start here, right? It's sort of like when I think about Christianity, when I think about converting to Christianity and actually going through the act of, say, getting baptized in a church, etc. Um, there's a lot in my mind that goes back to kind of having to make a certain profession of faith, right? A certain kind of like signing on to a creedal notion of like what it is that you're joining. And of course Christianity has many doctrines, has many creedal statements, and these have historically been framed in kind of you know a more traditional pre-modern framework of sort of another world. There's transcendence. There's a divine figure over and above the world, etc. And that's precisely what's become so challenging for a lot of people in our contemporary world, is trying to kind of match their sense of reality in 2024 with creedal statements about the nature of kind of ultimate reality that seem to reflect a different way of conceiving the world as a totality. So starting there, first of all, orienting us a little bit, like, am I reading too much into the role of doctrine and belief and creed here in your own relationship with Christianity? Is your relationship, what is your relationship to creed and doctrine and sort of like the essential kind of defining tenets of faith in being a practicing Christian?
So I mean, maybe the very first thing would just be to grab that word, faith, because I suspect. So maybe primary caveat. I've mentioned this before, and it's still very much the case. Is in this category of theology, I'm very soft clay, so I can't say I have a particularly mature perspective on anything, and I'm quite likely wrong about almost everything. But so nonetheless, I am where I am. So I'll just be sharing that. But the point is to say, if I'm wrong, don't be surprised. um, what I've noticed is that if I delve into the notion of faith, both from the point of view of kind of like from a historical, linguistic, semantic, etymological, multilinguistic comparison, maybe philosophical is the way of thinking about it, and then scriptural. I take a look at where it shows up in the scripture and see like what it means maybe in its context. I can't help but notice that it does not appear to be the category of propositional.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not of that category. In fact, I think I mentioned on the Jim Rutt show that if you sort of take a snapshot of contemporary linguistics and you say, okay, what does faith mean? Broadly speaking, and this is both weirdly, not weirdly actually, coevolutionarily, in the secular mind, particularly the scientific secular mind, and in a sizable fraction of the Christian mind, particularly Western American Protestant, it broadly means something like maximally delusional propositional beliefs. Intentionally, right? The more it can't possibly be empirically true, the better, in some sense. This is from the point of view of the Christian, and from the point of view of the secular, the worse. And this is where, by the way, the notion of the flying spaghetti monster actually comes up as an example. You believe in God, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster. You premise the notion of faith as being really firmly believing in something that can't possibly be true. So therefore, I'm proposing something, a flying spaghetti monster, that's even less likely to be true than a creator God. So therefore, my faith is even stronger and more pure. So the argument, the sense I have it is that is completely wrong. That's not at all what the notion of faith means.
Mm-hmm.
And it's wrong for historical reasons, which are interesting. But the place that I've come to, and it's actually just recently I've begun to formulate it this way, in some sense, sort of derivative of Paul. There's like a stack, and an ontological stack. Maybe it's an onto-epistemological stack now that I think about it. But it goes like this: it goes love, hope, faith, understanding, say communication or creed. Narrative, story, propositions. And this maps, I think, maybe to Vervaeke's propositional participatory stack in some way, where at the deepest level of intimacy of relationality, love is the fundamental, and that's the basis upon which everything is built. And so in this case, I would speak of faith primarily as the boundary condition or the connective tissue, the layer between the existential, the beingness in world, and its qualitative characteristics, and then the understanding. Right? So the ability to begin to produce mental models, and then of course to produce expressions of those mental models is above that. So in that category, for example, I would say something like the cultivation of the capacity to play music on a guitar is an expression of faith. The ability to do gymnastics is an expression of faith. The ability to sail a sailing ship is an expression of faith. And it's important from my point of view to actually articulate it in that way so as to separate it quite vigorously from propositional so that you can get the parallax view to see that this is actually a deeper kind of thing. And when I look at it underneath the layer of understanding, what I'm talking about is something like an integrated capacity that has both a towards you facing, so it's deeply intimately related to your full wholeness, your wholeness of self, and has formed a very subtle nuance and intimate what's that called, grasping or affordance with some aspect of reality. And this is what allows you, the conformity of contact, that Vervaekean language, which allows you to then be in relationship with the other, right? So faith is like the substrate. I can't help it. I'm like visually seeing something like, quicksilver or silly putty, right? Something that has this ability to be molded to shape into something. And it's the way that yourself comes into conformity of relationship with something that is outside of self in its particularities. And then from which, once you've actually come into that conformity of relationship, you come into sort of close, intimate contact, then you can achieve understanding. And by the way, understanding in this case also shows up as skillfulness of relationality. So to say that I understand the guitar is to say that I have embodied a capacity to produce in relationship with the guitar something that is an expression that flows through it. I've almost integrated it into myself so intimately that it becomes an instrument of my own expression. So does that all kind of make sense of what I'm
Yeah,
describing?
yeah, it does. I mean, and at a very kind of high level abstract sense, it's very difficult to, say, no, no, that's not, but that's, I want to kind of drill down a little bit underneath that and start to get into some of the propositional elements. I mean, we could stay at the meta level and even ask questions about, right, like what is the role of proposition in faith, or what is the role of a professing, sort of belief and allegiance to certain presumptions about reality. I mean, I think that the point's very well taken, right? Like faith is a translation of the Greek word pistis, which originally meant like trust, or you put your sort of it's a second person relationship, and you don't have it's not a given, but you're entering sort of a trusting relationship with someone. And I think that there's a very easy way of appreciating that there's a deep notion of faith in that sense that certainly goes far beyond more recent kinds of faith as belief in things that aren't true, sort of a thing. Though, of course, Paul does himself say faith is the belief in things that what is it? What's the language there? Faith is the hope in things that aren't present, or I'll have to find that. But so point well taken on that. But I do find what's that?
Pistis is the hypostasis, right? So it's the actual substance or the assurance of things that are unseen.
Assurance of things of unseen. Perfect. Yes, thank you. But in my understanding of converting to Christianity, and again, feel free to say no, this is not the way that I think of this, or what I'm doing. But in my understanding of it, it is this sense of there is a literal coming to Jesus moment where a person says, you make the metanoia, the conversion, and you say, I was like this, and now I'm going to be like this. And a big part of me being like this is by declaring, I believe about Jesus, things about God, things about my soul, things about the resurrection, etc. And so there is, and there always has been in the Christian faith, a large emphasis on getting the propositional content right. Now, maybe you say that doesn't matter, that's not so important to me, but then that would also then kind of demand the question, well, why convert to Christianity? Or so just thoughts on that
Yeah.
relationship first.
So one of the things I'm doing, and by the way, I'm doing this in the context of my church, so this is
Mhm.
something activity in the church, is trying to get things in the right order. And so, for example, we can do it in a number of different ways. One might be something like, when you have the sacrament of marriage, you say something usually, or somebody says something and you say yes to it. There's something that is a signature. Now, is that the thing? Or is the actual cultivation of the real relationship, of which that is a signature at the very end, the thing? My point is that there's the latter, not the former. And so if we get hung up on whether or not you said I do in the ceremony, without actually building up the underlying fabric that is the
Right.
real relationship you have with this human being that you're entering into a lifetime relationship with,
Yeah.
then you're getting things perfectly upside down.
Yeah, no, totally true. In that case, though, there is someone that you're marrying. So there is another human being there, that there is a relationship that exists. And so, yeah, getting caught up in the formalities of, the languaging and all that, I totally agree. That's not the point. But if it turned out that that person standing next to you was a figment of your imagination, or if some of these people are doing, marrying a robot or marrying a dog or something like that, people would be like, wait, you know what I mean? So then the
Yes,
nature of the reality of that relationship becomes important. And so the
right.
degree to which propositional, even creedal or doctrinal language captures the reality of the nature of things becomes an important touchstone for thinking about one's deeper faith. Does that?
No, I don't think so at all, actually.
Okay.
I mean, um, the propositional is extremely light. It's not, it's on the surface. It's a thing that we can use to orient our shared awareness towards something, but it's neither the something nor our awareness, right? So it's a pointer, and which is a helpful pointer. It's helpful, maybe is the right way of putting it. So you could ask me a question, for example, do you have a relationship with Christ? And I would say, well, I think I understand what you mean by that. We may have to disambiguate because your
Mhm.
point is something very different than
Right.
what but that's the basis, right? So
Yeah.
the basis is there a person? Are there three people,
Uh-huh.
right? But is there a person, Christ? And have you cultivated a relationship with that person such that you really are able to say, yes, I have a relationship, and that relationship is one which is strong enough that I am actually able to and feel comfortable choosing to make my choices on the basis of that
Yeah.
relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So that could be a great way into this. And I will add also in that context, that Christ is understood in the Christian tradition to be the historical person of Jesus of Nazareth as well, right? So there's a propositional element to that, to the degree that when one talks about Christ, the relationship of Jesus, the person, and Christ as sort of the Messiah and the kind of sacred and spiritual conception, I guess you could say, is an interesting relationship that we could explore. But there is a notion that like around such and such a time in ancient Palestine, there was a human being. He did things. Those things are recounted in the Gospels, etc., and that is sort of the source origin point for this whole conception of things. So again, there is like a particular emphasis, I think, in the Christian tradition to make claims about reality. And whether we want to think about that as propositional language or what have you, or doctrine or creed, there is still this sense of like we make claims, we believe certain things to be true, and they either are or they aren't. So it's like important how we understand reality is, I guess, just the broader way that I conceive of that.
Yes,
But
we're
yeah,
going to wrestle on this, and I think
yeah,
we should.
yeah, yeah.
So I would say maybe two things. First is, as far as I can tell, in my studies of both, we have sort of right now the advantage in some sense of being able to integrate the three major Christian strains, which do actually have quite a big difference, particularly the Eastern and the Western. The Protestant Catholic is less of a significant distinction at this level.
Hmm.
In terms of worldview and something like epistemology, let's say, it's actually deeper than epistemology, but the Eastern and Western strains are quite different. And so that's useful because they're present right now, both in terms of using the internet, you can access them quite
Right.
nicely. And there's a lot of activity in people thinking. So that's one, like a longitudinal assessment of existing lineages.
Hmm.
And then historical. You can dig back and look at the historical um, ways of these different lineages. So you can look at the Cappadocian fathers and compare that, for example, to say the medieval scholastics, and notice the shift in the underlying um, like the deeper senses from which they were then coming at the world that they.
Hmm.
The reason why I say that is that um, when we make claims about reality, what kind of epistemology are we smuggling in below that?
Hmm.
Obviously, in the contemporary environment, much of the epistemology that we smuggle in is something of the fabric of a journalistic slash scientific fabric of epistemology. Um, but that is not A, the only way
Right.
that one claims about reality, or B, the more fundamental way that you make claims about reality, or C, the way that Christianity makes claims about reality in its sort of most fundamental senses.
Hmm.
And I think this has largely been where Western and mostly Protestant, and to a lesser extent Catholic,
Hmm.
has gotten in an eddy, it's gotten lost because
Hmm.
it imbibed the epistemology of the Enlightenment. It then endeavored to recapitulate its own faith upside down, like in a
Hmm.
mirror, say,
Yeah.
from that epistemology, and this fabricated what would sometimes be known as literalism or
Hmm.
variation, which is our efforts to make journalistic claims about reality, which is fundamentally operating from a journalistic epistemology.
Yeah.
Um, that's
No,
fundamental.
yeah, I agree with that assessment. And to be clear too, so one of the things that's I think very important is not to get stuck in this classic sort of like Enlightenment, modernist, scientific or scientific even conception versus pre-modern religious, mythological, whatever, as that's tended to be framed, or even to look at that through the lens purely of these different epistemologies that are just sort of incommensurable and coming at things from different angles. I think that when you get stuck there, you get stuck there. But what I'm excited by, and you mentioned Vervaeke, and you mentioned, the kind of optimal grip and transjective framing. I think we're at the point now that we've moved past that impasse, or not collectively, but I think we have a roadmap of how to more effectively integrate different epistemological frames so that we don't just get stuck in this cul-de-sac.
Well, yeah, hold a second. It's a confusion.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
get confused, and then we think we're doing something when we're actually just going around in circles.
Right. And I'm not coming at it from the angle here of like, well, religion makes these claims, but now modern science says that that's not true. So what? That I'm more coming at the angle of religion does make claims. Christianity makes claims, and even if those claims aren't understood in a literal way, or they're not understood historically or even propositionally, then there needs to be a translation process in my mind for how we make that leap. Right. I had a great podcast conversation with Layman Pascal a while ago, where I gave him basically just a list and of words like spirit and God and numinous and religion, and it's sort of like, how do you understand these terms? What do these terms mean to you? Right now, Layman gave incredible answers that it still really impact the way that I think about all these things as well. And I think that translation process is not only possible, it's necessary. And at the same time, though, different people asked those same questions would define, say, God as, well, God is the creator of the universe, and, back however so long ago when he got things rolling, and he is a person, and he's invisible, but he's not really in, and then people would like start to try to articulate something more of what we would associate with a kind of postmodern epistemological framework of thinking about divinity. And so there, I guess, without belaboring the point, I think there are more or less sophisticated ways of understanding words like God or Christ, or maybe even words like sin and resurrection. And so part of what I wanted to do is, if that lands for you, is like to hear how you conceive of these things. Like when you do have a relationship with Jesus Christ, right? A lot of people might immediately associate that with how they hear most people use those terms, right? But presuming that there's some different way that you're thinking about all of that, it's sort of like, how do you think about that when you do talk about having, as you mentioned earlier, is a good entry point, a relationship with Christ? What do you mean by Christ? Let's start there, I guess.
Okay. So let's see if we can do this. Yeah. So implicit in the conversation we're having is something like metanoia, meaning, given the context of the people who are likely to be watching this, I'm hoping that what we're doing and what I'm saying is not going to be just completely confusing. But the point is, I'm invoking awareness of worldview. Right? I'm invoking awareness of awareness. Right? There's a very complex place we're in. So as I say something, there's a cultivation of the actual being, the kind of being or the kind of mind that can actually grok something. I'll use grok because it's a nice word that kind of sits out there in a weird space. Rather than endeavoring to think that you understand what is being said from the worldview that you may be operating in. So that's kind of the precursor. And that's kind of the key point, right? Because if you look at it from what are the things that we can say that would begin to allow us to have something like a relationship with Christ?
Yeah.
And there's something like maybe three kinds of categories. One is scripture, qua scripture. Right? So we have the words on the page. They've been scripture. They've been written down. And by the way, I'll include in that the oral traditions that many of the churches have maintained. I don't think there's any separate them. They have different abilities to verify and interact with them, but whatever, that's a category. So we can say that with some degree of confidence that Christ said, metanoia, repent and sin no more, or repent and follow me. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. So a variety of things that we can point to and say, okay, there's some reason to believe, some methodology by which we can come to believe that this is things that Christ said. And I'm, by the way, saying it both in the chronological and the chirological sense. So said at a particular point in chronological time, and is saying in an eternal sense, in the chirological sense. Then we actually have history, right? So we can use this the kind of the secular methodology of endeavoring to triangulate by means of multiple different kinds of artifacts, whatever those artifacts might be, mostly written, of course, but they could be physical artifacts, the classic secular methodologies, and endeavor to do something to place this particular Christ in some place and do something there. So, for example, we could say, we think he spoke Aramaic, right? And therefore, we could draw some conclusions about that. And then the third, and this is from the point of view of, let's say, kairos or logos or the word, would be to identify what are the characteristics of first-person experience that are qualities of the person of Christ. For example, I had a really fun interaction quite serendipitously with a woman at a cafe where she started sharing some of the ways that she had come into this relationship. And she had a great, how do I say, she had a relationship with Christ's sense of humor. So she went back and she sort of narrated her way of reading some sections from scripture. And I was looking at it through her eyes, and I was like, wow, yeah, you're right. That is hilarious. And you're right. Christ was almost certainly at least partially joking or kind of winking and nudging when he was doing this piece, which I hadn't had that part. But that sense of humor, that's interesting. When I spoke about this piece with my daughter, my 5-year-old, I said, how do you come into relationship with the fireplace? Well, you feel its warmth. You know that the warmth is a quality of fireplace. And by the way, also burning is a quality of fireplace. And so you learn to come into relationship with it as a thing that is out there in the world. And to the degree to which you're able to discern where qualities that are part of the person of Christ, the Word of God, are part of your experience, when you love your wife, when you feel forgiven, things like that, then you can notice that perhaps those qualities are expressions of the source and origin of those qualities in reality, and that then gives you an orientation towards the person that is the provident. Right? So in yourself, of course, and in your relationships, almost always in your relationships, relationship with yourself would be the former. So those are the three. Right? Those three. And I tend to triangulate with those.
Well, that's great. That's very helpful. And it's interesting, thinking about those three: scripture, history, and this kind of first person relational sense making, if that's a decent summary of those. So of those three, I can really intuitively understand a Christianity from the last one that you spoke of, the kind of first person relational, this kind of lived experience and intuition and a relationship with reality that uses the Christian tradition to orient oneself in relationship to others, to oneself, to the world, by using that rich tradition and its symbols and its and all of that. That to me makes a lot of sense. So I just want to put that there. Where I get and have gotten tripped up is on the scriptural and the historical side, because from my faith journey, those are precisely where it didn't work. Right, I had that first person connection, I had the relationship, I had the prayer life, and I had that sort of a thing. But when I went to study the scriptures and when I went to study the history, I couldn't then make those two things work anymore together, the first person element and the kind of historical and scriptural element, because I had all this new understanding and new information about the texts, where they came from. I had a bunch of new understanding about the nature of religious anthropology, etc. And so I was like, ooh, these now have differentiated and crumbled into two different things. And so for me, what would I say about that? I guess just briefly, I could say that, like, because of that, then I've become sympathetic to the perspective of folks who want to lean into the kind of Schleiermachian experience-based, like first-person element of this, and sort of eschew the scriptural historical stuff is like, yeah, that's kind of more mythological, etc. We don't really, we can use it for its rich heritage of symbols and images, but we don't see it that way. Like historically, did Jesus Christ as a human being, rise from the dead? I mean, even Paul theologically says if that didn't actually happen, then we're fools, right? So like there's a deep theological historical element. And that's, for the record, too, a lot of what I mean by the propositional side of things. So last thing, and then I'll just, feel free to respond to this however it
Yeah.
lands for you, is
Go ahead.
is
We'll put,
just, oh, sorry, go on. Yeah.
I'll mark that one. Keep going.
Okay. And so, my thought would be folks who come into Christianity aware of the historical and the scriptural difficulties, let's say, who sort of put that, you know, how would you say this? Who acknowledge that, but don't emphasize that as the means to the spiritual connection of their conversion. That to me makes a lot of sense. So, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on if that resonates with you, how you're thinking about it, or do you think that if not, if we're losing too much by basically setting aside the history and the
Oh,
scripture,
we're
how do
definitely,
we bring that back in a way that doesn't create so much cognitive dissonance?
yeah, we're definitely losing too much, and it's sort of, in some sense, it's very easy to see how that would be because we're very foolish beings, and our own psychology is sort of perfectly optimized to bullshit ourselves. And so, if we're sort of relying entirely on our first-person
Mm,
experience, we will almost certainly bullshit ourselves into
right.
oblivion rapidly.
Yep.
We can try to do it interpersonally, like so in a body of a group of people, but that doesn't work either. And we can see this happening in a variety of different cultural efforts. So we have to have something that is, let's say, of the objective, and by the way, of the transcendent objective and the transcendent subjective, that has that we can rely on, and we can orient toward and say, okay,
Hmm.
it turns out I'm wrong. Right? It turns out, okay, I thought X, and I maybe really felt pretty confident about X, but now that I've got this deeper perspective, I realize, oh yeah, I was wrong. Right? So we need some way of doing that.
Hmm.
And it's not very complicated. Like obviously, if we operated in an entirely solipsistic, purely subjective world and assumed that all objectivity was nothing, then of course we would become perfectly
Yeah.
wrapped up in acts instantaneously.
Hmm.
Um, so interestingly enough, what I found is that I benefited from the fact that we live in a highly digital and even AI world with regard to some of these questions of interpretation, like hermeneutics,
Hmm.
ultimately.
Hmm.
So again, remember the stack. So at the bottom of the stack where it was love, hope, and faith. And what that means is that we our primary hermeneutics is a hermeneutics of presence. Are we actually able to come into presence of God as a primary way of making sense of literally anything? And that's interesting, actually, by the way, it's just a proposition as a thing to say. Um, and then as I started looking at, okay, let me start doing things like, okay, Paul's, I think, correct. And so if there's no meaningfulness and deeply grounding, like potent meaningfulness to the proposition that Christ died on the cross and then came back from the dead, was
Hmm.
resurrected, then Christianity is not a particularly useful way to proceed forward.
Mm.
You want to go drop into Buddhism or I don't know, something like that, or
Yeah.
paganism. Actually, I would say that old-fashioned indigenous paganism is probably a better ground.
And I'd love to just put a pin in that. I want to come back to what you just said. There's a lot there, but I don't want to interrupt you, so keep going. Sorry.
So, then we have how do we say, an effort to cultivate a capacity to have faith, and remember, capital F or asterisk, the way that I'm using the term, with regard to this state of reality. That Christ was right, there was an incarnation of the divine in a physical human body, born of a physical human mother and raised as a child in a real place in chronological time,
Hmm.
named Jesus, and he was crucified in a particular moment in time and a place and a way. Right, all that stuff was like part of a lived reality that was perceived using the senses of Homo sapiens that were adjacent to it in the ordinary way that we would imagine. Right, and then that particular person, that identity, in a way that's a little bit difficult to exactly dial in what that looks like, is raised from the dead. Right? So that's an assertion about a reality. And when I take a look at, and by the way, using things like ChatGPT, and pulling in those questions, What I noticed is that I found myself very unconcerned with the, let's call it academic critiques of that. In fact, I found myself increasingly encouraged because I could punch through the tissue paper thin academic efforts rather quickly using more advanced technology to grab more broad information that was available during the lexical book age. It's actually rather intriguing because I, of course, came in with a baseline assumption. Well, I can't say, of course. If you've listened to me in the past, you know that this was the case. I came in with a, pretty straightforward scientific materialist baseline assumption and modified with some orientation towards spirituality in a sort of the last decade. Sort of more opening. I think I probably would have been in the same box as Greg and John on the extended transcendent naturalism, something like that. So the notion that a particular phenomenon like dying and being raised from the dead is part of reality would have been received with high skepticism. But I feel totally comfortable with that now. It doesn't bother me in the slightest that it's a historical event that actually occurred in chronological time and is a binding of a chirological event that has to do with the presencing of the transcendent in a way that the transcendent shows up in the immanent or in the lived experience of reality. And I did a meaningful amount of research and pulled up a variety of different sources on that.
So yeah, so this is great, and this is really helpful. And this is kind of precisely what I wanted to get into and explore. Because to use an example, right? Like some people could talk about the resurrection, which I'll just make that the kind of term for capturing everything you just summarized there, the resurrection. Some people can talk about that and mean it symbolically, right? They can say, the resurrection points us to notions of rejuvenation or transformation or et cetera, right? Some people can talk about the resurrection in ways that don't frame it essentially the way that you just did, which is that it's something that happened in historical time, chronological time, and that it does actually have the theological import that you're suggesting, that it connects this transcendent to this moment. And so that's a helpful clarification because for me that helps orient what kind of Christianity I guess is in the conversation that we're dealing with, right? Because when someone says I converted to Christianity, right? Like, what does that mean? Does it mean I found a tradition home for my spiritual search? Does it mean I like certain kinds of rituals? Does it mean I got baptized and now I'm going to go become a missionary, to the heathens in Africa or something like that, right? Like there are all different ways that language
Heathens
can,
in for sure.
yeah.
Um,
No, I just mean that the different forms that the conversion to Christianity can take in people's worldview and in the way that they language it and understand it can mean different things. And so I think we're starting to narrow in on the specific notion that you have of what Christianity means. And so that's fascinating to me. And so now I want to dig into that a little bit, which is, all right, given that framework.
wait, can we pause there? Because I think
Sure,
we
of
could do
course.
a triangulation on that to
Sure.
narrow it in.
Yeah.
So after getting baptized, and then after my wife choosing to get baptized, which came a little later, she was baptized as a Catholic. She chose to get baptized again. We then had a conversation with a friend of ours, and she said, well, you guys have, that's wonderful. And yet now you've got some trouble because you're living in sin because you're not married properly. And I said, okay, yeah, you're right. So keep that in mind. Right? So in terms of orientation of actual choices, this is the kind of the deeper substrate. This is the thing between hope, faith, and understanding. How you actually living. There was an ability to be in relationship with an individual who expressed something as a truth, and then an ability to say, yep, that is an accurate guidepost for behavior that I accept as governing my behavior at a cost to the optionality of the kinds of things that I might like to do, which in this case meant having sex with my wife. She said, okay, well, I said, what do you have to do? We have to do two things. One is you have to become celibate, live celibate until you get married. And of course, that means you have to get married properly. So we did both of those things. So as a way of understanding the lived consequences, that's not a tremendously heavy example, but not trivial either. And then of course, and more. So as a way of shaping an orienting basis for choice
Yeah.
And if that's like deeper than propositions, again, kind of
Yeah.
to hammer on that, are you imbibing or clarifying is probably a better way of putting it. Are you clarifying what is the orienting basis for choice?
Yeah.
What are the hierarchy of values that are governing the choices that you're making? And of course, governing each other in their own relationships.
Sure. Yeah. No, and that's I think that should always be in the background here, that any religion or conversion experience that just ends in now I say I believe X, Y, and Z, but doesn't change behavior or impact behavior is, a kind of shallow, superficial act. And so I think always if we're understanding, a genuine religious relationship or a religious, I don't know what language you want to use, entering into a religious modality and way of being, that is across the board, informs behavior, what you believe, what you think, your understanding of reality, and your relationship to reality and to ultimate reality and to the transcendent now redirect your behavior in the world in real ways.
I would
That's that.
formation of identity.
Oh, sorry, go on. What'd you say?
I would say formation of identity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's kind of captures a lot of that. And that's why this is so important, because if one's working with an understanding of reality that then changes their behavior, and their sense of identity, with very big implications and repercussions, then you really want to make sure that your shifting sense of reality like tracks with flourishing and all that, right? Because for example, right, if one assents to the notion, both propositionally, but then allows us to guide their behavior, that there is an eternal hell in which people who do not accept the fact that this Christ figure died and rose from the grave to save them from their sins, if that whole sort of package of ideas is not something that they adopt, assent to, and then agree to live their life by, then if they don't do that, they're not probably very keen to go out and try to change other people's minds and get them to believe as well. If you do believe it, then you're
Right.
thinking, oh my gosh, here's, 8 billion people. How many of them are going to be
Oh, yeah.
suffering eternally forever? And so
Right.
it's my job to help with that. So it really does have these huge implications. But I want to, so that's kind of why I think it's important, and I think that's traditionally why it's been important for people to get a sense of what's really being assented to in terms of claims about reality. So I want to dig in, if we can, about like the notion of Jesus Christ having lived a life, died in historical time, and returned to life. How do you affirm that? What's sort of shifted in your sort of notions of causality and maybe a particular naturalistic framework in a way that now you, as you say, like you don't have any problem affirming that? Like there must have been some shift, and is there a way that you can explain kind of your angle on a notion like that, which, as you point out, that in like today's naturalistic default context, a lot of people would say, well, that's not possible, that didn't happen, etc. So like just talk a little bit about your thinking about that.
Sure. So let's see. Actually, by the way, just one step back. I would generally say yes to a number of the different frames you put earlier. So the symbolic frame,
Mm-hmm.
but we'd have to be careful because I don't mean symbolic as metaphor. I mean symbolic as of a particular kind of thing,
Mm.
as well as the chronologic. So largely speaking, I will operate with sort of this notion of the vertical and the horizontal, or the
Mm-hmm.
eternal or chirological and the chronological, because that's helpful to me to hold it right now. And that the symbolic is of the eternal or of the chirological.
Mm-hmm.
So it's less that it points you towards ideas than it points you towards reality in a way that is orienting towards the eternal aspect of reality. And then of course, the chronological. And then both are important. I mean, both are actually part of reality. Reality is kind of the union of those two, more or less. So, well, the first is, I'm not naive about the rigor, epistemology, history of the kind of the dominant, as you talked about, the dominant mode of scientific materialism. And so I'm painfully aware of the hand wavery around the axiomatics at every level. Right? So the axiomatic of the fact that all of the scientific method makes a wide variety of utterly unscientific presuppositions about the nature of reality that it accepts because they're useful, which is fine. And of course, it's a perfectly good way of behaving, but can't prove using its own methodologies, which it can prove that it can't prove using its own methodologies. And of course, painfully aware of the fact that we either try to posit a moment of creation at a sort of a distant T0, basically a pseudo-deist sensibility. There was some moment of creation. We wave our hands vigorous around exactly what happened there. We maybe argue that there were particular fundamental laws of nature that were put in place and some kind of starting conditions that unfolded according to those laws of nature. That's what led us to where we are. But then, of course, we're waving our hands vigorously around why would that be and how did that happen? Sort of, and then again, it's a very deist sensibility at the end of the day. And then we have the difficult ontological problem of the category of emergence, which is to say, well, then, okay, what about phenomena in experiential reality that appear to not have been part of a moment in time and are part of a moment in time later? Were those created in that moment, or were they created in some kind of Platonic formal sense? And what does that mean as an ontology? Right? Does that mean we're now importing a Platonic ontology where the whatever we call it, the iPhone is a Platonic essence that created at T0? Again, now kind of locating it back at our deist moment of T0. And the emergence of the iPhone in 2006 was merely the actualization of that in a kind of a chronological instantiation, but creation didn't play any part of it. Or was it created actually in reality as an ontological phenomenon in 2006, in which case creation is now playing a role continuously, but doesn't have any place to fit in the naturalistic model. And so those kinds of things are already very well part of the way that I understand the limitations of how we try to frame reality. And of course, I was already, over a period of time, increasingly familiar with a variety of different worldviews, different indigenous worldviews, different religious worldviews. And so to get there, you remember me talking, golly, way back at that London event with David Fuller's group. What were they called? Rebel Wisdom. I talked about this before that, but I remember very specifically sitting there talking about the necessity of developing transcendent or trans-paradigmatic mind. So from a point of view of trans-paradigmatic mind, a lot of these questions become what I would say now is actually, by the way, faith, FYI. Because you can't rely on an existing paradigm to verify the reality claims of that paradigm, particularly when that paradigm is able to verify that it can't bootstrap itself into existence, which none can. So therefore, I'm not particularly troubled by the notion that a particular worldview imports notions that are in violation of another worldview, because I know that other worldview imports notions that are in violation of its own worldview. Right? It's already incoherent in itself. So the fact that naturalism is incoherent means that I don't feel overly burdened when I rub up against its edges. It's already bullshit. It doesn't bother me. That's okay. So then I say, okay, well, what are the things that are the basis here? One, well, let's see, in order. Well, I won't do it in order historically. I was both dealing with the Trinity here and dealing with things like historicity here, more or less at the same time. And at this moment, I can't actually remember which one landed first. I think probably historicity landed first because the problem is bigger. The Trinity problem is bigger. The historicity was something like, I feel very comfortable with the notion that a very large number of people, this is kind of the evidentiary, almost like the law school sensibility. From an evidentiary perspective, a very large number of people really did believe that that's what happened. And they evidenced it in a way that is sort of a very high standard of evidence. So in terms of the historical narrative, the notion that the events that were written in the synoptic gospels occurred more or less the way they did is probabilistically well above my epistemological threshold of true, meaning that a lot of people believed it and evidence that they believed it strongly. At least as likely that Kennedy was assassinated or that the Challenger blew up. Sorry, 2 generations from now. So let's see, take it back. At least as likely as Pearl Harbor happened. So then you have to deal with the ontology or something with the metaphysics of, okay, how does reality work? And for me, that was the work with the Trinity. Because of course the Trinity, A, if true, and B, by necessity, is as deep as you can go into the stack of metaphysics. And of course it correlates so nicely with the Neoplatonists that we can actually kind of wrestle with both simultaneously and say, okay, people who've been working at that kind of stuff very diligently at the philosophical level butted up very close to the Trinity on their own. And then we can take a look at the Trinity and say, okay, what is a minimum viable kind of boot protocol for any possible reality? And it turns out, and we we may spend some time digging into this, but to bracket it for a moment, as I dug into it, and of course I spent much of a lifetime thinking about that particular problem, the Trinity happens to be that. And so once that landed, then what I found was that my ability to form a worldview had to be governed by the most basic, compact, fundamental, comprehensive boot protocol for any possible worldview. So it lives at it lives at the transcendent, not the meta. Right? It's the thing that governs all possible worldviews by nature. And at the very least, that made me very comfortable with, okay, the laws of nature are themselves subsidiary to whatever it is that governs how the laws of nature are formed. And the notion, for example, that to be resurrected is impossible is sitting within a framework that is itself already easy to deconstruct.
Okay.
So I can accept it as possible. I can accept it as a bunch of people who were present there really thought it was possible in a way that's got strong evidentiary value. Proceed forward from that basis. I can live there and be like, okay, fair enough. I can live my life on that basis. What does that imply? And just let me finish this last piece.
Sure.
I just want to return to the stack.
Yeah.
And then from the stack, I've kind of worked my way all the way up to the top of the stack, is from understanding into doctrine. But I need to then, on that basis, then go back underneath and okay, what happens if you begin to live and notice, like, where is the life part? Where is it's the life part? Are the fruits being born? And that's a deeper truth. Like, it's a deeper validation. And so as I began to live in that way, what I began to notice, as was promised, was an unfolding of like the deeper substrate of reality, pre-understanding. Which, by the way, over time had this really interesting consequence that when I ran into places where my ability to understand something in scripture, for example, there's many other things, but in scripture, I was like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. I started pouring through it and analyzing and triangulating it and watching videos and reading a bunch of secondary works and asking AI to help me understand it and creating, like, having ChatGPT spin off like 5 theologians in dialogue over it and watch as they talked about it. The more I just lived it, the more I actually had a transformation of identity as a consequence of a new, and let's say more clarified and stronger orienting basis of values. And living more in that orienting basis, less noisy is the right way of thinking about it. Understanding began to unfold. Like, I get it now. Like, I didn't see it at that point in that way, but now that I'm over here, that actually does make sense in a really interesting way, because it makes sense in a way that where the insight that shows up also is participatory. Like, there's a growth of self as a result of being in relationship with the new understanding. Okay. That was a lot.
No, it's great. Thank you. That's very helpful. And I mean, the frame here is not for me to, I don't feel like it's right to get into like responses to all these things. If you ever wanted to, or if people were interested in that might be a thing to do, because you raise a lot of points, and then it's sort of like, there's a lot that could be sort of countered, I guess you could say. But I don't want to do a debate. I'm more interested to hear, your perspective and how you're thinking about this. So I'm not gonna, kind of respond to those things, because that's not what the conversation feels like it is. But I really appreciate you framing this all out. And I think maybe in a different context, it would be really interesting to see how we could explore all the things that you're getting at, that there might be other perspectives on. But I wanted to pick up more to continue you articulating your perspective on this. Is again, so that where you landed there with the participatory aspect and the living into it, and the ideas shaping not just sort of the sense of flourishing behavior, but also informing understanding by means of participating in a certain orientation and a certain set of I'll just say beliefs, but not the best word, faith, you could even say. All that to me lands again very strongly in that first person kind of category that we were talking about, in a way that I understand. One of the things that I'd like to ask you, though, is based on all that you said, from this sort of trans-paradigmatic, to use your term, approach to this. And I think I understand the same concept when I talk about meta-systematic, but there might be differences. But you're talking about like being aware of worldviews, right? And having that factor into your conceptions of this. I guess my question would be, what would you make of the notion that what you're describing is possible in any other world religion as well, right? Like someone moving into deep engagement with, say, Judaism or Islam could find a similar rich tradition, similar tradition of people who are engaging this stuff, living it, participating in it, a text that they're relating to, and all of that leading to this sort of reciprocal opening that they're experiencing that sort of self-confirms it. And then that sort of forces this issue, right, which has been an issue around world religions since largely, the spread of modernity started bringing more and more world religions into contact with each other and raising the issue of like, oh, there are billions of people who believe this, and there are many people who believe this. How do we know that we have the right one? And that feeling like you have the right one, again, seems to be an aspect that's important about this perspective. So can you speak a little bit to how you understand the relationship to other religions and how everything that you're describing is this sort of a template that trans-paradigmatically you could apply to other religions? Like you could basically do all this with Judaism, you could do all this with Islam, and if not, why not? Right? What's special about Christianity that sort of makes it right and those ones wrong, if that is the right way of looking at it? Does that make sense as a question?
Sure. Let's see if we can hold that for a second. I wanted to
Sure.
rewind a little bit and put something out there that we might want to come back to,
Sure.
but I want to forget neither one.
Yeah.
Um, I think there's something really interesting to be delved into the possibility that we actually don't mean the same thing by trans-paradigmatic in
Mm.
medicine.
Okay.
One of the things that came to my mind is I was having a conversation with somebody, and they were sort of accusing me. I think is the right way of putting it. There was an accusatorial tone for sure. Of
Which,
this,
by the way, I hope is not coming across in this conversation at all. I hope
and by
this
the way,
feels very generative and I like the challenge and everything.
it's fine if it did. It doesn't, and it's fine if it did.
Good. Okay.
Everything is good.
Well,
It-
these are such rich and important topics. I think that right, it's worth to like get into it. And so, with being
yeah,
someone of your mind and someone who's clearly thought so much about this and felt so much into it, that's why your perspective is so fascinating. And so, I do hope it comes both to you and to the audience as coming from that place. But anyway, go on.
we're endeavoring to be in dialogos about this thing,
Precisely.
right? So, he accused me of objective morality, of proposing that there was an objective morality, and I thought about it for a while. And I think that the thing I would put out there is something like a transcendent subjective.
Hmm.
It's not the same kind of thing, but is actually what we're really talking about.
Hmm.
And so we can delve into that if we'd like. Okay, so let's go to well, the two connect quite nicely. So we can talk about traditions, we can talk about practices, lineages, liturgies, which is a very powerful thing. We can talk about the unfolding in across time and in contexts. And I would say something like the simple answer to your question is, and this is absurd, but it's exactly right, is that Christianity is true if it's true, which is to say that if it true, so the propositional content of Christianity is true to the degree to which it produces a way of life and a communion that is in fact truing, making things more coherent, more harmonious, more wholesome, more whole, in a fashion that is in the direction of the ultima. And so, I can say from my own sense, one of the reasons why I ended up, say, choosing Christianity for my delving into this life is because when I perceive the Trinity, what I perceive is something that is as fully complete, compact, precise, ultima in every direction as I have been able to conceive.
Mm.
And I can compare that to some of the equally sort of fundamental characteristics of other adjacent religions, and say, okay, those don't have that, and therefore they will fail in sort of some finite time under some finite conditions, because that's you need to have something at that level of say, well, those characteristics if you want to be maximally true. So it's like an empirical assertion across a sort of an infinite set of test cases. Says that you have to have something which is capital T true if it wants to continue to maintain its integrity across that set of contexts.
So, well, one, that's really interesting when you talk about truing, because one book that was really oddly influential in my spiritual journey was reading the book The Truing of Christianity, and this would have been back in, I don't know, 2002
Hmm.
or something, very a long time ago. That it was grappling with some of that, but so just languaging in that way though can be very helpful. And the idea behind that I totally agree with. Is that again, it's sort of the classic by their fruits you shall know them sort of a thing, right? Like this is if it's true, it will true, and it trues, and it leads in that direction. Um, again, though, coming back to the kind of religious pluralism question, I guess, is one could make the claim that other religions function similarly. They produce a certain truing in their congregations, and
Oh,
that
they
people.
must. By definition, they
Sure.
must. The question
Yeah.
is not. That's not the question.
Okay.
And we call it a new aged health advice. Will have some degree of truing,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Whatever health fad you happen to have attached to, which is a flavor of religion in a very limited sense,
mm,
some degree of accuracy to it.
mm,
That's not the question. The question is, in the context of, let's say, the whole, and I mean this both spatially, temporally, and causally,
mm,
is it a categorically true in a way that it actually is able to be at the top of the stack?
mm,
So to put it quite simply, like for example, if I were to say, I'm going to take Judaism, and it's a tradition with which I have some familiarity, not tremendous, but some, and I would to put the Trinity into Judaism, and then I'd have to go through the process of playing out all the implications of that.
mm.
That's Christianity. Same thing happens with Islam, by the way. Um, and so that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so if I adopt the Trinity as being more fundamental than, let's say, a monotheistic sensibility, or a simple monotheism, maybe a better way of putting it,
Mhm.
then those two lineages, for me at least, are like, okay, those are obviously off in a very particular way, and that often ultimately cascades to significant consequences. Although I don't necessarily, I can't like run the calculus and say here's what that consequence is, but I could do it. I could do here's what happens. I mean, the Eastern Orthodox. I mean, think about something as somewhat trivial as the filioque, and the schism, the Great Schism,
Uh-huh.
happened over what ostensibly is a very trivial line of text.
Mm.
There's other things going on, but at least one level that was happening.
Mhm.
But the Eastern guys, I think, quite correctly say that look, if you grasp and understand, well, if you truly do grasp and understand the Trinity with this particular dimensionality to it, then you're taking it out of true, and it will
Mm.
ultimately produce a wall that does not stand.
Interesting.
And so, okay, fair enough. So that implication is, and you can think about this from like a software development perspective. If you're trying to do large system software development, and you've got some very particularly wrongly
Yep.
architected elements at the base code,
Sure.
that's going to end up creating all kinds of weird error conditions.
It's a very interesting thing hearing about the role that the Trinity played in your conversion for lots of reasons. Clearly, because of a lot of the stuff that you're outlining here, and this is just more of a reflection than a question, but it, there's an argument that could be made that the Trinity actually is more of a product of Neoplatonic thought that sort of gets imported into Christianity, because if you look for the Trinity in Scripture, it's kind of hard to find. People have the claim could be made that you could retroactively.
Crazy. Yeah. So I think Pageau did a really good job with this with regard to narrative, and
Mm,
I think he's well, obviously, I think he's right. We could do the same thing here philosophically. So the Greeks were handed a particular lineage that oriented towards the cultivation of conceptually clear and precise things, for whatever particular reason. It'd be kind of interesting to see if we could find out why, but for whatever particular reason,
I have some theories. Yeah.
yeah, the Greek lineage went down that path,
Uh-huh.
and so they carved that. And in fact, they adopted a position or a stance that personal gods and mythos was kind of yucky relatively early in their arc,
Mhm.
and more and more into this feeling comfortable with their own version of bullshit, right, based on the Platonic sensibility.
Mm.
Fair enough. And there's something about that that's beautiful and good. And it allows them to do a lot of very precise surgery at the conceptual level. So from that point of view, as kind of that body, that organ in the body, um, something like the frontal left lobe of the body of Christ, it's not surprising that they produced the kind of clearest linguistic, conceptual slicing and dicing of something which by hypothesis is just reality. This is important. Right? This isn't, if it is reality, then it's just reality. And the traditions that are reporting on that reality are doing, reporting on the piece of the reality that they're reporting on. But the reality is the reality. It doesn't matter what the particular tradition is doing. So then when I look at scripture, I see over and over again, like if I look at it through that lens, I'm like, wow, holy smokes, like it's over and over again and deeper as I start pulling it apart and start taking a look at it. What is there, what person is being talked about here in the Old Testament? Like, oh, interesting. I assume naturally, because I was pre-assuming when I first read it that this was all sort of one dude. But now that I look at it, it's pretty obviously not the same dude, because he's speaking about himself in two different ways in the same sentence. Obviously, there's two dudes going on here, and they're playing different roles. What's happening? And obviously, in the New Testament, it's also relatively easy to hammer out. Now, of course, language is flexible, and midwits are extremely apt at endeavoring to demonstrate skillfulness by playing with language. So we can sort of play games with trying to do the postmodern thing on anything written down. But the point is, once you kind of grab the Neoplatonists are the guys you go to on that front and say, well, we're going to grab fundamental reality in the conceptual level at this place. Thank you. Right? You provided that toolkit. But sorry. So Pageau's point was that for the most part, you look at the history of narrative, and you're like, wow, there was well before the Jewish flood, there was the Sumerian flood, and well before the Christ story, there's like 5 or 6 different mythological stories that had sort of gods or demigods. Some went to Hades and came back. Some died and were reborn in different ways. Body parts put apart, sewn back together. Like that story's in the mythos, and so we can sort of say from a more erudite and mature perspective that these are all old stories, and the Jews were copying older stories before them, and the Christians were copying stories before them and fabricating something in their current environment for whatever reason we use stories for. By the way, of course, at that moment, the postmodern iteration recognizes itself as a story and then collapses cigarettes and turtleneck. But Pageau's point is to say, well, if we flip it around and we say, well, the logos is that from which all stories are fabricated, and the logos has a nature or a fundamental pattern to it, it wouldn't be surprising that literally every story will come up with some variation on that set of patterns. And that's no longer really the question. The question is there something about the way that is expressing itself in the Christian story that is more clear, more complete, more orienting than the stories that we saw in the past? And so then he does the same thing going forward. You say that as this Christian story interacts with other cultural narratives as it plays out in time, and of course we have to look through a diffraction pattern, because the pre Constantine absorption into Rome is one phase, and then the post-Constantine, and then the post-fall of Rome is another phase. So each one has slightly different sort of actual historical chronological implications for how those things played out. But one of the things that we notice is an annealing effect, right? Where as a particular cultural narrative interacts with the Christian story, it drops part of itself, but other parts of itself come into the foreground. I mentioned this in other calls. So, for example, the Slavic, Anglo-Saxon, and Celtic warrior mythos transforms into the chivalric knight, right? Which is different than a Viking in a big, profound ways, in ways that we, looking at it, would say, yeah, these are all good ways, actually. The chivalric knight has martial prowess, greater, superior than the Viking, but also isn't a bloodthirsty berserker murderer. And holds a code of moral conduct that constrains his behavior. Like, that's interesting. You interact these cultures, and the people at the time, like as these things are being moved forward, that integration is saying, this is what happens when you bring something into this notion of being true, or to be trued. So the truing of the Viking and the Celtic and the Anglo-Saxon mythos brings it more towards its more true version of itself, which would then be the chivalric knight.
Couple questions, and we can start to draw to a close here, though. I mean, there's so much we could just keep going. It's fascinating stuff. So two questions come to mind. One sort of a meta question, though I guess they're kind of related. It's Well, I'll start with the other question first. You on the topic of this truing bit, and again, I'm totally in agreement with this notion that um, if sort of a certain propositional set of claims doesn't, when engaged, lead to, greater flourishing and wholesomeness and wholeness, but actually tends to degrade and break down, that's a great sign that there's something wrong with the kind of propositional element there. Let's put it that way. Or that propositional element somehow needs to be buttressed or balanced against other concerns in a way that what I ultimately am getting at is that, yes, things kind of are confirming or disconfirming based on how they get put into practice and how well they sort of aid in flourishing and thriving and viability, and that is a very legitimate sort of sign or to be using in sort of asking questions of what is real, which in a way I'm trying to summarize a little bit some of that argument of sort of living into the faith and have it sort of confirm the kind of doctrinal aspects element of this. And so hopefully that characterization of it isn't one that
No,
you
no, I do want to push back on that again.
Okay, go for it.
I'm pretty sure, but I may be wrong. So the propositional claims would be useful to the degree to which they help us more effectively orient towards the deeper truth that we are actually discerning through the process of becoming or identity formation, character formation, or faith. And so the propositional claims themselves are not carrying the payload.
Mm-hmm.
They may help us orient towards the payload that we are living into. And so just things are separate.
Though at the same time, engaging with new propositional ideas can transform behavior in such a way that retroactively makes those propositional claims seem more true, in the sense that, for example, before you converted, the notion of, quote, living in sin wouldn't have resonated with you. After conversion and after entertaining this new set of orientations towards reality, conceived of propositionally, then retroactively you say, well, if all that is the case, then
see, that's you. It's funny, the little comma, you had me, and then the comma, conceived of propositionally. That's not the thing. So what happened is that if I'm interacting with it from the point of view of the propositional, living in sin doesn't land. Once I have, in fact, sort of adopted a way of living and a way of perceiving reality, then somebody can utter the same set of words, and they are pointing to a location in the transcendent that, with my faculty of faith, I can now perceive. And I can now perceive that particular location in the transcendent as being something that is more towards the truth.
Sure. Yeah. And by adding in the
are doing.
No, that's a great clarification. I mean, I would see this in a sense sort of dialectically. So there's not really a start to the process. Like, you hear something, you think about it, it draws you closer, then it changes your behavior, and then that there's sort of a feedback cycle that would be happening. And this is reciprocal opening in a way, right? And by adding the propositional in there, all I mean to be saying is that we're talking about linguistically mediated concepts and ideas, right? If we didn't have language, we might live in certain ways, but like the claim that thousands of years ago, there was a person, he died and then he was resurrected, and somehow, like, that is, if not propositional, conceptual. We're using language to talk about this thing that happened. And so,
I mean, I know haven't got much time, but I'd see if we could get to this, like, get it, because I think we maybe have just gotten closer. So what I would say is that, clearly there's a series of words that are uttering from your mouth, and those are the propositions. The point is, the reality itself is not the propositions. It's not contained in the propositions.
Right.
That's the thing that changes you.
Yes. Okay.
Relationship with the reality. So the propositions may bring to my mind, an awareness of a reality, or at least the possibility of reality, which then I can then engage in with some relationship, which then may lead me to some change.
Great. Yeah. So that's actually, no, I'm really glad we clarified that, because that'll reframe the way I'll ask this question, which is, you're talking about a truing experience with Christianity that's led to this kind of reciprocal opening and a feeling. There's a feeling there that kind of confirms that, as a sense of, yes, this is true, this works. And the question relates to the issue of, it also seems that for many people, it leads to the opposite. It leads to pathology. It leads to broken relationships, antagonism, judgment, religious wars, etc. There's a whole bunch of negative stuff that also comes out of the engagement with, let's just say, Christianity. Now, originally, I was going to say, I was going to frame this question as like, well, why does it lead to that for those people? But in light of what we were just talking about, would it be right to say that those people are just using the propositional and conceptual language of Christianity, but they're not engaging with the reality that is in reference to, and that is why those things manifest that way?
But I
Um,
think there's a little bit more to it than that. Like there's
sure.
actually one step more to it than that, which is why. Why is that the case?
Uh-huh.
And so what I would say is that I think very deep in the stack of this invitation of metanoia, it's not the most fundamental, but it's pretty close, is precisely putting back into the proper relationship the participatory and the propositional. And so it's important to recognize that there is a way of life that is governed by the propositional. Way back, I wrote an essay called Simulated Thinking and Thinking. It's the same distinction, right? And so, and our world is governed by that way of life.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, we've been governed by that way of life. And it may, in fact, be a thing, kind of an eddy that humans fall into because we are so dominated by the need to be able to perform in interpersonal rhetorical flourishes, right? If the concept of rhetoric exists in your culture, then that falling into that form of governance is available.
Sure.
The systems of justification problem that Heinrich points to.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for reasons that have been explored over here in the category of, let's say, complicated and complex, for example, to the degree to which your individual choices and your collective choices are predominantly governed by the logic of rhetoric, by the logic of systems of justification, by the logic of simulated thinking, then that will, in fact, have a whole series of pathological consequences. And by the way, local optimal attractors that will pull you deeper and deeper into that pathology and get out of it, right? So the first move of that metanoia is to say, over here is a different kind of fundamental sort of posture in relationship to reality and in relationship to things like mind and proposition. And that this has a different set of consequences. So that would be the first, like that'd be my first sort of major response to that reality.
Yeah. It does seem to lead to, and this is part of the second question, but the whole no true Scotsman fallacy, right? It's sort of like, well, because if you're talking about truing Christianity and it's like, what's true Christianity? Well, it's not, all that negative stuff. What is it? It's the good stuff. And so the true Christianity is whatever the good, what leads to the good. And on the one hand, there's a profound reality to that, right? Is like, because the good should be leading us to, yeah. On the other hand, it can kind of be a sort of, backward sort of, kind of tautological self-justifying thing, which
it's like a fit. You're fitting the curve, reverse fit.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's possible. Could be.
Well, let me phrase this as a more in-depth question, because this was my last question, is sort of like, based on these dynamics, which we're in agreement operate in the world and this is how we should this is how we should come into relationship with truth. Is not just working with propositions, not just working with, sort of participation or procedural knowledge, but somehow this kind of complex dynamic interweaving of all these things that should ideally be self-confirming in some way. But it seems like there's a danger, which you could just classify simplistically under the banner of something like confirmation bias, right? That as you move towards a certain attractor, in this case, Christianity, but it could be another attractor, right? And you start to see some positive, changes in both your life and your understanding of things. And it seems like there's this reciprocal opening going on that feels right. That isn't necessarily evidence always for it actually speaking to something in reality. It could be speaking to other factors, and that if we get stuck in a loop where what we believe we can affirm because it kind of improves us or kind of makes us feel a bit better in some way, then we're more apt to believe it. That actually can itself become sort of a mechanism for bullshitting ourselves more and more. For example, right, you get into a cult and it's sort of like, all those cult dynamics come out to play where, the cult leader says the more you see people push against you is more evidence of the fact that you are one of the elect and they're one of the, sheep or the goats, whatever. And then when people start telling this stuff to other people, then sure enough, they get pushed back, and it's a confirmation bias that winds up radicalizing them further. And the concern I would have is just that a lot of these dynamics that we're talking about have that danger to them. So how do you navigate that? If that makes sense, and how do you keep the dangers of all this in mind? What other aspects are going into how you're understanding and sort of filtering the nature of reality?
Well, Well, interestingly, this is an epistemological method that I actually formulated at least a decade ago, because it's a generic problem. It's a problem across all. Once you sort of exit kind of a naive paradigmatic sensibility, you're stuck in that question.
Mhm.
And if you haven't exited naive paradigmatic sensibility, you're stuck in that question without knowing it. Right? So that's
Right.
that. And as far as I can tell, it's a triangulation. Oddly enough, like maybe symbolically so. And there's three elements, right? One element is that to the degree to which there is something like the transcendent, can you orient yourself towards that transcendent? And what I mean by that is something like call it symmetric across all transforms. No change in any material context will change its isness.
Mm.
So you mentioned something like the concept of the good as a transcendent concept. If you're actually able to be governed by that entirely and completely, and by the way, that's very dangerous too, because if you take any subset of the good and govern by that, then you're going to create catastrophe.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why you need the good and the beautiful in there as well. Then you will be moving more and more towards it. Like that's a tautology, but it's a positive tautology.
Sure.
Right? In some sense, if I'm living inside, let's say by hypothesis, I'm living inside a cult, but by virtue of living inside that cult, in an infinite progress, every aspect of the good, the true, and the beautiful are increased on a continuing basis, then that cult is in fact true.
Right. Yeah, sure. Yep.
So we just did, okay, if that's what we're governing ourselves by, if we're able to perceive the transcendent and allow ourselves to hold that with as much clarity and precision and completeness as possible, then that's one like really strong ground that you can be anchored in.
It's a fascinating.
The second,
yeah. Oh, go on.
Please, yeah. The second is this notion of this transcendent subjective. And this has to do with the cultivation of increasingly sophisticated, and again, I'll use this word faith, but I'll say it slightly differently, which is like feelings. And we can think about this in the context of like taste. Beauty is a good metaphor here. Beauty is a very good piece. In fact, this probably is the realm of beauty. Playing music. And so if you cultivate a capacity to play music, one of the things that you notice is you can actually progress in that direction. You can become more sensitive, more nuanced, more subtle. You can actually begin to appreciate qualities that maybe had felt or seemed dissonant before, but not naively, like as this sort of very pre-trans sensibility. And that's a real thing. Like you can really notice that's an actual development of competence in some particular regime or domain, right? And again, that's a cultivation of faith. And so that element, cultivation of faith. And here, the answer would be multimodal. This is, again, what we're, from an educational perspective, you want to become a master in something, like true mastery. But then you actually want to see if you can explore mastery or the direction out of mastery in highly non-adjacent domains. Because that's a core that starts to develop this sort of, again, a triangulation sensibility, and you're building a richer and richer element. So this is you need multiple different consilient ways of perceiving in the domain of faith so that you can develop competence there. And I'm saying faith because that's a deeper substrate. It's the thing that from which discernment and perception of quality is where art comes from. It's perceiving things in that way. And the last, of course, is actual relationality. At the end of the day, if what we produce is peace on earth, a thriving world, wholesome, happy humans in right relationship with nature, and something that appears to be ongoingly resilient across an arbitrarily large number of possible bad things that might happen, then who gives a fuck? That's a pretty good result. And so you can notice that, and you can notice that. Really, yeah, it's not, there are boundary conditions. Oh, wow, we got up to like 12 people, and we were really great, and then it collapsed, catastrophic. Okay, that problem, something was wrong. What was wrong? And of course, I went through that process very self-consciously, because I was able to use stuff from the first category to be able to explain why the world that we live in, although it includes a lot of people, is very much it's a death cult. Like it's going to terminate in a very bad way. Oh, okay. Well, that means that I can use category one to notice increasingly what that looks like. What is the degeneracy and the incipient collapse of a world, a way of living that is ultimately corrupt at its heart? What does it look like as it proceeds towards its corruption? Right? That was the kind of the early game A, game B work. And so from that diagnostic, people say, oh, shoot, it does look like that's what's really happening. Pivot. What does it look like to try to actually find a way of living that is more fundamentally grounded? And so this reciprocal opening between three different modes is the methodology that I've adopted to navigate that question. Right. And as far as I can tell, it is going to be as good as you're going to get. I haven't found anybody else's better one.
No, all that lands, and I'm totally in agreement with all that. It's very interesting for me because when we talk about the dynamics at play here, when we talk about the epistemological angle and all of that, the trans-paradigmatic, I can, fully on board with all that. For me, the sticking point is it does relate to, and I'll be careful with my language here, but it does have to do with the way that we talk about and understand reality in sort of causal terms, which I would class as, you can use different language for that, as like conceptual, propositional, what have you. But there's a presuming way that reality is, and we use words and language to talk about it. And yes, those are just symbolic mappings onto reality, but still you can have more or less accurate mappings. And I feel like if you don't have the closest map, then you're going to have a wobble in the rest of the other things that are going on there. Like if you have a really strong community and you have a really this and that, if the community is formed around an understanding of reality that's far enough off from that reality, then it's going to introduce that wobble that will eventually kind of catch up with it and lead to some kind of self-terminating dynamic. And you could look at the history of Christendom perhaps as an example of, a version of that playing out. And so where I get hung up is not in the dynamics, it's in the way that we talk about reality, and just brings it back to some of those things we were exploring at the start. Like, is resurrection, bodily resurrection, possible? Is there an eternal, place of suffering and torment for the unbelieving? Is there a transcendent being that, set things in motion? And a lot of the kind of architecture of the worldview, if that's where I reach that wall. And so, yeah, I find it
So,
fascinating. Yeah, go on.
yes, no, yes, no, yes, but in a very unusual way. There. Move forward.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think we're kind of reaching that point that I put in earlier, which is maybe the distinction between metasystemic and trans-paradigmatic.
Mm.
What I would say is something like, maps are useful, but there isn't going to be any sort of perfect map. So that we know that's not too much trouble.
Mhm.
We probably are going to need a variety of different maps
Yep.
and some meta mapping differential. But there's also something else going on, which is to have an intimacy of relationship with place. I'm using the metaphor of map very directly. That, an indigenous person didn't ever have a map.
Mm.
They were the place.
Mhm.
They were fully integrated with the wholeness of the place. They lived the place. They drank the place. A map is a third person relationship with the place, first person relationship with the place. And that intimacy is more fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I totally agree with the triangulation framing of this. It might be more fundamental, but we need both of those because it's a great way. And I mean, you see this, it's very easy to get confirmation bias and animistic projection going on if you're relating to reality purely from the first person perspective. And so that dynamic you brought up earlier about having to compare and contrast and get feedback from other people, we need a corrective mechanism, so that we're not bullshitting ourselves. To me, like, science is one great way that we do that. It's not the only way, but it's one great way. So that's why I think, yeah, you need a whole kind of approach where you've got the first person and you've got the third person, you've got the second person, you've got that all in the mix so that they are hopefully mutually corroborative.
You mean you need three persons?
Well, right, exactly, right. So that's a great way of just sort of like, we'll let that be what that is. So anyway, hey, this was amazing. Thank you so much, Jordan. I really appreciated this. I felt like we really got into what I was hoping to, some of the stuff we could get into. Yeah. Any other final thoughts before we kind of close this up that you want to throw in, or any? Yeah.
Well, for me, it's curiosity. Like, I'm always curious about how these kinds of things ripple out into the world. We're having a conversation. In terms of our conversation, yeah, it was great. It was really nice, and with the time, it's good, but very nice to get to know you better. And also, part of why we're having this conversation is that we have some sense that somebody else in the world might find it useful, although that may be thousands of years from now. So we don't want to sort of like wait too long. But I'm curious. I'm quite curious to see what results.
Definitely. Likewise. Cool. All right. Well, thanks again so much. Really appreciate it. And maybe we'll continue the conversation down the road and get into the stuff we didn't get into today. But thank you, Jordan. Appreciate it.
Welcome. Bye-bye.